If you ever cast your eyes over the northeastern borderlands of Vietnam, a region of endless overlapping mountains shrouded in year-round fog, Lang Son Province is immediately what comes to mind. This is a land of immense strategic importance, boasting some of the busiest trading border gates such as Tan Thanh and Hun Nghi. It is also home to the unique Ki Kung River, which defies nature by flowing backward to the north into China instead of emptying into the East Sea like every other river in this S-shaped country. Nestled deep behind those misty valleys lies Con Ke Commune, the ancestral homeland of the Thai and Nung ethnic minorities. Here, the local people are honest and rustic. They cling to their hillside farms every day, living a secluded, tranquil life that flows like the stream beneath the mountain pass, peaceful alongside the stilt houses where blue smoke drifts in the afternoon. However, on a fateful morning in 2008, that peaceful, quiet atmosphere was brutally shattered by a piercing shriek that echoed throughout the mountains and forests. A horrific crime, an unimaginable and bizarre tragedy occurred, shocking not only the villages of Lang Son but also leaving the entire national media and public at that time in utter disbelief and horror. An innocent child, as pure as a wild forest flower, was murdered in the most catastrophic, barbaric way possible by a beastly act that crossed all moral boundaries of humanity. Even more terrifying, the perpetrator who unleashed this nightmare was not a stranger from afar, but a neighbor who saw the victim every single day, living right next door. Together, we will turn the pages of the darkest, most melancholic medical and legal files behind the frenzied life of a criminal worse than a wild beast, Ha Van Pao, a felon who once sent shockwaves through all of Vietnam. In 2008, a part of what is now Con Ke Commune was known as Dong Giap Commune, located in Van Quan District, Lang Son Province. That year, little Hoang Thi Duyen, born in 2002, was just turning 6 years old. Duyen was born and raised under highly unique circumstances in Koc Sang Hamlet within the old Dong Giap Commune, which has now been merged into Con Ke Commune, directly under Lang Son Province. Her father, Mr. Hoang Van In, born in 1970, returned home after completing his border guard military service and married Ms. Nguyen Thi Mai, born in 1969. The couple was no longer young at the time and struggled with infertility. It was not until 2002 that they finally gave birth to Duyen, their only child. Consequently, this little girl was not just their reason for living, she was their entire fortune and the sole hope of their lives. However, driven by poverty, they had to move to Quang Ninh Province to work as hired brick-carrying laborers, managing to return home to visit their daughter only once a week. In their absence, little Duyen was sent to live with her paternal grandmother, Ms. Ha Thi Nghiem, who was 75 years old at the time. Duyen had reached the age of senior kindergarten and babbled happily all day long. Every time Mr. In came back to visit, Duyen would earnestly beg her father to stay home and play with her. Mr. In's family lived in a stilt house in Koc Sang Hamlet. Koc Sang was a sparse settlement with just a few Nung ethnic houses, roofed with traditional tube tiles, nestled amidst vast wet rice paddies. The house where little Duyen lived was barely half a kilometer away from the house of Ha Van Pao, located in Napan Hamlet, just one village above. In this mountain valley, the two families maintained a very harmonious relationship. Pao himself would walk along the dirt trail in front of Mr. In's house every single day to reach his hillside farm, occasionally dropping by the yard. Bound by the neighborly spirit of mutual support in times of need, Mr. In's family always treated Pao with great kindness, helping each other with village chores, and not a single dispute or conflict had ever occurred between them. Since she was a toddler, little Duyen had been familiar with the face of this neighbor. Every time she saw Pao passing by, she would politely greet him, calling him Uncle. The horrific event unfolded on the afternoon of January 18, 2008. Being neighbors, little Duyen frequently went over to play with little Loi, the child of Ha Van Joan, Pao's biological older brother. As on any other day, the two children were skipping and playing in the front yard. On that fateful afternoon, Pao returned home from selling firewood and had consumed some alcohol. He paced back and forth several times behind them, then suddenly grabbed little Duyan by her hair and used the back of a sickle knife to strike her hard on the nape of her neck, knocking her unconscious. Seeing his uncle erupt into a frenzy, the nephew panicked and ran for his life to inform his father. Meanwhile, Pao grabbed the 6-year-old girl by her hair, lifted her up, and staggered back to his house, muttering as if cursing at someone. Upon hearing his son's report and knowing that his younger brother was having another psychotic episode, Mr. Havan Joan rushed over to intervene, but Pao refused to listen and shoved him away. Possessing a small frame compared to his towering, mentally ill younger brother, Mr. Juan was knocked down to the ground. The older brother recalled, "At this point, Duyan had regained consciousness. I could still clearly hear the little girl's piercing cries for help." Disregarding the pain, the older brother threw himself into a struggle with his younger brother to rescue the child, but he was slashed once in the head and once in the arm. He fled to a nearby neighbor's house before collapsing into unconsciousness, only managing to mutter incoherently, "Pao is having an episode. He caught Duyan. Go save the child." The entire village was sent into shock. A group of people quickly rushed Mr. Joan to the hospital for emergency care, while the rest surged toward Pao's house. By this time, Pao was holding the knife, challenging the whole village. "Whoever steps in here, I will hack them to death." Knowing that this madman would dare to do anything, the villagers were terrified and shook like a leaf. No one dared to approach. The locals quickly reported the incident to the local authorities. Commune militiamen were deployed to guard the perimeter from a distance. Realizing the extreme severity of the situation, the local authorities reported to the 113 emergency police force of the Langsun Provincial Police to rescue the little girl. According to the accounts of the local residents, there had never been such a massive police presence in the village before. Normally, not a single car was seen in the area, but that day was filled with the roaring sound of sirens and vehicles rumbling in. The villagers also gathered in large crowds along the roadside and in front of the Commune People's Committee office, whispering and waiting for the police and authorities to handle the situation. Knowing that Pao was a reckless and physically powerful man who knew a few martial arts moves and possessed a bizarre trait of once rubbing an entire bowl of fresh chili peppers onto his face and eyes without any harm, the police and local authorities meticulously discussed operational plans. Around 9 p.m., law enforcement forces executed the ambush to capture Pao. Knowing he was surrounded, Pao stubbornly cowered beneath the altar inside the house, cursing and threatening to take the life of anyone who dared to step inside. Dishes, teacups, and furniture inside the house were thrown all over the place by him toward the crowd outside. With a sharp sickle knife in his hand, no one dared to get close. When the village chief reasoned with him in the Thai language, Pao cursed back in Tay. When the locals pleaded in the Nung language, he shouted back insults in Nung, and when the police called for his surrender in the Kin, Vietnamese language, Pao echoed back challenges in Kin. Realizing that the suspect could not be persuaded, the final strategy was deployed. Dozens of police officers silently closed in on the house, simultaneously spraying tear gas and throwing smoke grenades to incapacitate Pao. The floor turned stark white from the tear gas, yet Pao still did not surrender. Like a rabid stray dog, knife in hand, he used all his strength to kick the door open and escape. Fast as the wind, he rushed out into the yard, lunged over the fence, and ran at full speed deep into the forest. He was so swift and powerful that he collided with a police officer, causing the officer's gun to knock loose from his hand. Terrified, the local authorities used public loudspeakers to announce that Pao had escaped, urging the villagers to stay on high alert. Still deeply concerned, they deployed 2 militiamen to every single household in the village to deliver the warning in person. Pao was still at large, and families must absolutely not open their doors to any strangers that night. Upon hearing that Pao had fled into the forest, the entire village was paralyzed with fear. All night long, every house remained tightly locked, and no one dared to step outside. After Pao fled into the deep woods, the forces breached the inside of his house. Among the officers who took part in the operation and the witnesses who beheld the scene inside Pao's house that night, Not a single soul could hold back their tears. There were tears of utter helplessness, as all efforts in the race against time to rescue the child had ultimately failed, and tears of profound grief for the agonizing, unjust death of a mere 6-year-old child. That night, the weather was bone-chillingly cold, with a light drizzle falling continuously. At the scene inside Pau's house, dismembered body parts were found, some kept in a bucket, others buried underground. Most horrific of all, a portion was found inside a cooking pot. The madman had cooked and consumed it. Throughout the grueling night, the forensic team gathered the remains, carefully reassembled them into their proper positions on the body, wrapped them in white cloth, and handed them over to the family for burial. The victim's family could not even weep. Confronted with such a scene, the victim's relatives could only collapse into unconsciousness. The crime was so gruesome that it surpassed the boundaries of human imagination. As news of the case spread across Langson province, tens of thousands of people who heard the story could not help but shed tears. After escaping into the dense forest, unable to endure the hunger and freezing cold, Pau voluntarily returned to the village around 9 a.m. the following morning. Spotting Pau walking aimlessly across the field wearing only a short-sleeved shirt, a local resident quickly alerted the police. After a brief struggle, the police successfully tackled and apprehended Pau. The portrait of the perpetrator. To comprehend the root cause that led to this horrific murder that shook the entire border region, we must look back in time to decode the life and the dark psychological corners of the perpetrator. The killer was Havan Pau, born on April 3, 1974 in Napan Hamlet, within the old Zhongjiap commune, now belonging to Khan Ke commune, Vân Quan district, Langson province. Born and raised in the northeastern valley, Pau's appearance and physical build were completely normal, just like any other local youth. However, hidden deep inside him was a delusional, frenzied world that gnawed away at his sanity day by day. Few knew that this homicidal madman was actually the son of a primary school teacher, a woman who spent her entire life dedicated to teaching literacy and was highly respected by the villagers. Raised in a family with a solid educational background, Pau was naturally lazy and playful from childhood, dropping out of school after completing only the 4th grade to work on the family's hillside farm. Upon reaching adulthood, roughly the age of a 10th grade student, Pau's cruel mental illness began to manifest through abnormal behavioral and cognitive signs. Noticing that their son was becoming withdrawn, sullen, and uttering delusions, his family tried every possible way to cure him. Initially, following high country customs, the family organized ritual worships everywhere and invited numerous herbalists to prescribe traditional medicine, but Pau's condition did not improve at all. Instead, it grew increasingly severe. By the late 1990s, when spiritual measures proved ineffective, the family finally admitted him to the National Institute of Forensic Psychiatry for continuous treatment throughout 1999 and 2000. Following these treatment periods, Pau was released back to his locality to live with his family under outpatient management. However, schizophrenia, coupled with a series of subsequent crises, pushed Pau's life into ultimate personal tragedies. Upon returning to the locality, like any other young man, Pau also fell in love, and after about 2 to 3 years, he got married. To arrange the wedding for her son, his teacher mother had to spend all her savings from her meager salary, costing millions of Vietnamese dong, a massive fortune in that poor rural area at the time, to secure a bride for Pau. However, this marriage lasted for a mere 4 to 5 months. During their time together, Pau brutally beat his wife, burned blankets and mosquito nets, and crazily hung his wife's clothes in the forest like evil spirits. Furthermore, because Pau suffered from erectile dysfunction and could not fulfill his duties as a husband, his young wife eventually left him for another man in Geelong. In response, Pau demolished his family's entire 5-room house to build a tiny hut. The sudden shock of losing his wife, combined with the painful regret over his mother's money going down the drain, caused Pau's mental state to deteriorate severely. A powerful wave of frenzy surged within him, driving him to seek death as an escape. Pao attempted to throw himself into raging waters twice. The first time, he jumped into a stream near the village. The second time, he sought out the Kekong River and threw himself into its violent currents. A cruel twist of fate allowed him to survive both times, but survival brought no awakening. Instead, it made the dark corners of his mind even more aberrant and bleak. In addition to the madness manifested outwardly, Havan Pao's portrait also contained horrific hidden dark sides that were only exposed when the authorities launched their investigation. According to official allegations from the authorities, before committing the murder of little Du Yan, Havan Pao had committed acts of sexual abuse against two relatives within his own family. This shocking detail stands as the clearest and most ruthless evidence of the complete corruption of his morality, lifestyle, and sanity. This distorted behavioral transformation was entirely driven by paranoid schizophrenia, the most dangerous form of the illness, turning a human being into a soulless monster stripped of all humanity, ready to slaughter an innocent child and destroy the generations-old peace of a high-country village. At the police station during his interrogation after being arrested, Pao exhibited mental symptoms and made incoherent statements such as, "In 1993, Du Yan's parents and uncle killed my parents, then pretended to be my parents. My current parents are fakes." He also claimed, "I suffer from headaches, stomach aches, and impotence." When asked for the reason behind murdering little Du Yan, he stated that every night he often dreamed of a higher being, a heavenly angel, instigating him to kill a person and consume the flesh so that his headaches, stomach aches, and erectile dysfunction would be cured. 7 months later, on August 24, 2008, the first instance court sentenced the defendant, Havan Pao, to death for the crime of murder and ordered him to compensate the victim's family 32 million Vietnamese dong. Subsequently, Pao filed an appeal, leading to an appellate court hearing on September 30, 2008. At the trial panel determined it necessary to submit the defendant to a forensic psychiatric evaluation to ensure proper legal proceedings. On January 8, 2009, Havan Pao was transferred to the National Institute of Forensic Psychiatry for observation and evaluation. Following a period of monitoring, the authorities observed that the defendant Pao exhibited disorganized thinking, delusions, and emotional and behavioral disorders. The authorities concluded that the defendant Havan Pao suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and that his criminal behavior was driven by his pathology. 1.5 years after the crime occurred, the People's Procuracy of Lang Son Province withdrew the decision to prosecute Havan Pao on the grounds that when committing the crime, Pao had lost the capacity to cognize and control his behavior. At the end of 2009, the Chief Justice of the People's Court of Lang Son Province issued a decision to apply compulsory medical treatment measures to Havan Pao, sending him to the National Psychiatric Hospital in Thuong Thanh, Hanoi, for treatment until his illness cured. In October 2011, more than 3 years since the tragedy occurred, a special dialogue took place right on the campus of the National Institute of Forensic Psychiatry between Havan Pao and a journalist. Here, facing the reporter, Havan Pao appeared with a sullen and downcast look. The compulsory treatment sentence had isolated him from his village, but the paranoid schizophrenia still clung to him, clearly manifesting through every mispronounced word, trembling tone, and fragmented stream of thought, sitting on the indefinite boundary between the sane part and the mad part. When starting the conversation, Pao displayed a bizarre naivety, causing the person opposite him to shudder at the deviant habits he recounted in a naive voice. He honestly shared that inside the hospital he really liked hearing dogs barking, considering it one of his favorite sounds. That naivety stretched further back into the past when he mentioned his own eating and drinking habits. Pao admitted he knew how to drink alcohol from a very young age, and since then, regularly every day, he had to drink a whole bottle of alcohol to endure it. After the naive answers about his freakish habits, a few rare moments of sanity seemed to surge, igniting within his mind the simple desires of a mountainous farmer. His voice trembling and slurring, he expressed his hope that the doctors at the hospital would allow him to return home to Napan Hamlet. He said he craved to go back to his hometown to farm and to personally plant various fruit trees on the hillside. Going even further, he also dreamed of marrying a wife and having children later on, living a normal life like many other men in the high country village. However, right at the moment when the sane part had just surfaced, the heavy delusion of the mental illness immediately invaded and distorted his entire thinking, especially when he mentioned the crime committed against little Duyen. When the reporter asked about the old story, Pao bowed his head, his face trembling, and mumbled that he had a very big fault. But immediately after that, that remorse mutated into an ultimately delusional and deviant way of making amends. He slurringly explained his compensation plan. Later, when I marry and have children, I will give one child back to her family to raise because my hometown has such a custom. The words uttered from the mouth of the perpetrator as naturally as a theorem proved that his sanity had been completely destroyed. He was not at all aware that a lost human life could not be replaced, nor did he understand the ultimate pain of the family of Mr. Een and Miss Mai. He only reasoned crazily through the delusion he self-attached to his hometown custom. Toward the end of the interview with the journalist, the delusion gave way to a fear and the belated tears of the fragile human part remaining within him. When mentioning his deceased mother, the schoolteacher mother who fell ill and passed away in bitterness after her son's crime, Pa suddenly burst into tears and sobbed. He was in pain, weeping for his mother who had been gone for a long time, but he was isolated at the hospital and to this day had not yet been able to light a single stick of incense for her. In a state of ultimate emotion and panic, he directed his eyes toward the reporter, earnestly asking to borrow the phone to call the only remaining relatives in his hometown. Amidst the cold space of the psychiatric hospital, Paul pressed the phone tightly to his ear, his daily slurred voice suddenly shattering into a piercing cry for help, weeping through the phone line. "Brother Joan, younger sibling Zuoi, come pick me up and take me home." The shattered, trembling calls of "Brother Joan, younger sibling Shuoi" echoed continuously in the room, like a desperate cry for help bouncing into the void, closing an haunting interview. A schizophrenic man who used his blood-stained hands to shatter the peace of a family and his own home now had to live long, frenzied, and lonely days within 4 isolated walls. The day of return. In October 2011, after more than 3 years of concentrated treatment, the National Institute of Forensic Psychiatry concluded that Ha Van Pao's condition had temporarily stabilized, was no longer in a dangerously agitated phase, and met the conditions for discharge. A specialized vehicle transported Pao from Hanoi back to Lang Son, handing him over to the local authorities of Zhonggyop Commune for community-based management. However, the vehicle bringing the schizophrenic man back to his homeland did not signify a reintegration, but instead opened a wave of panic, plunging the high country village into an unprecedented psychological crisis. The first door slammed shut in front of Pao's eyes was the rejection from his own flesh and blood. Pao's family at that time included his father, who was over 80 years old, and his older and younger brothers, who already had wives and children. Even though he had previously wept through the phone to beg for help, when he actually stepped down from the vehicle, both brother Joan and younger sibling Shuoi resolutely refused to receive this brother. The family's old stilt house in Napan Hamlet had been demolished, and Pao's brothers themselves had to face the heavy pressure of making a living, scrambling for food and money every day. But above all, the biggest reason for their refusal was ultimate fear. They could not and did not dare to live under the same roof with a man who once carried a powerful physique into a frenzy of delusion to brutally murder a 6-year-old child. The cold refusal of his family officially pushed Pao into a situation of having no home and no relatives to care for him. In particular, an extremely serious risk emerged as soon as Pao stepped off the vehicle. He absolutely refused to take his medicine. Although the hospital had provided and fully handed over specialized neurological medications with the requirement that he must take them regularly every day to maintain a stable state, upon his return, Paul completely rejected taking the medicine. In a context where he was abandoned by his relatives, with no one by his side to care for, manage, or enforce the use of the medication, the only outpatient treatment regimen to restrain the madness was completely invalidated. At the same time, Pau's appearance in the locality ignited a terror that enveloped the entire village. Residents from Koksang to Napan hamlets panicked extremely, rushing in crowds to the headquarters to fiercely protest against letting this madman live freely in the community. The climax of the fear took place right on the first night Pao stayed in his homeland. Amidst the silent space of the mountains and forests, whenever he heard dogs barking at the beginning of the hamlet, Havan Pao immediately started barking along in an unconscious and crazed manner. That bizarre, eerie sound echoed throughout the valley, becoming a horrific obsession that made the atmosphere of the countryside suffocating. From then on, not a single resident dared to step out onto the road after sunset. Families tightly bolted their doors in silence out of fear. Because no one would harbor him, Pa was temporarily kept inside a small room located outside the Commune Committee headquarters, guarded daily by the village security, civil defense force, and the youth union. However, just 3 days after returning to the locality, Pao's illness relapsed, causing him to continue causing public disorder and vandalism around the area. After just a few days under management, he was allowed to drink alcohol, move around freely, and utter vulgar words. Faced with a fierce wave of resistance from the public and to ensure security, on October 15, 2011, the authorities of Jonggyap Commune had to come up with a temporary situational solution, pooling local budget funds to send Pao back to the National Institute of Forensic Psychiatry on a voluntary basis, paying a fee of 6 million Vietnamese dong per month, maintained for a duration of 2 months. According to the hospital, if Pao was still not cured by the end of the treatment period, he could continue to stay at the Social Disease Care Center of his local province. However, the director of the Department of Labor, War Invalids and Social Affairs of Lang Son Province stated that Lang Son did not have a social disease care center, but only social protection centers intended for vulnerable people with no one to rely on and drug addicts. Leaving Pao there could pose potential risks to the management work of these centers. Legally, Jonggyap Commune bore no primary responsibility for looking after and managing psychiatric patients. Relatives also refused to sponsor Pao to bring him home for care. This information sparked controversy surrounding the lack of specific regulations and handling guidelines for public authorities and treatment facilities in managing abandoned patients with highly relapsable conditions who pose a danger to society: the lonely death. By 2012, when the period of temporary institutionalized care ended, the meager local budget was exhausted, and the hospital resolutely returned the man due to the expiration of their authority to hold him. The return of Pao once again placed the authorities of Vân Quan district at that time into a dilemma, exposing the ultimate confusion of the healthcare and social welfare management system regarding dangerous psychiatric patients. Evaluating this impasse, Mr. Hoang Van Thuot, a representative of the Department of Labor, War Invalids and Social Affairs of Vân Quan district at that time, frankly shared the impossible reality when finding a solution for Pao's case. The authorities had considered building a small, compassionate house for him, but not a single person in the locality, from relatives to neighbors, accepted to stand out to supervise and manage him on a daily basis. Mr. Thuot brooded over a bitter legal and humanitarian paradox. If we use chains to lock him up, the authorities violate human rights laws, but if we do not chain him up and instead set him free, it is far too dangerous for the lives of the surrounding residents. Now the only way left is to release him at the edge of the village, because we don't know what else to do. The helpless exclamation of the district official fully depicted the fragile boundary and the deadlock of the management agencies. Havan Pao at this point was like a ticking time bomb being pushed back and forth between parties. The hospital returned him because their compulsory authority had expired, the family disowned him, the residents drove him away, and the authorities were completely helpless in finding a mechanism for safe isolation. To cope with the threat from the powerful madman and to soothe the neighborhood's wave of outrage and ultimate fear, a special room in the form of a bunker was erected. It was a dark, solid space, completely isolated from the outside world. Havan Pao was kept under house arrest inside 4 cold concrete walls, living the life of a wild beast day after day, eating, drinking, and carrying out daily activities through small crevices. That bunker did not just imprison a frenzied physical body, it was the darkest manifestation of a deadlock, where a human being was stripped of minimum rights in exchange for the safety of the community. However, that lingering existence inside the bunker did not last long. 8 months after returning to his hometown, Havan Pao fell severely ill. He remained bedridden for 3 consecutive days, his body becoming bloated with severe edema due to complications from his long-standing mental illness and exhaustion from the deprived living environment. His family decided not to call a doctor to treat Pao. On January 12, 2013, he took his final breath in ultimate loneliness. The commune health station subsequently issued a death certificate for Havan Pao with a brief stated cause, death due to illness. The lingering tragedy of the case even brought a cruel irony of fate even when he lay down beneath 3 feet of earth. Due to complex feng shui reasons and local customs of the high country indigenous people, the grave of the killer Havan Pao was buried at a location very close to the grave of the victim, little Hoang Thi Duyen. That harsh proximity between a delusional perpetrator and the poor 6-year-old child was like an open wound, forever embedding a dull, unsoothable pain into the heart of this mountain valley. Many years after the case, the father of little Hoang Thi Duyen would often sit staring blankly by the stream. Grief and pain were still visible on every facial feature and gaze of the ill-fated couple. Ms. Nguyen Thi Mai, Duyen's mother, appeared aged and withered. Throughout her entire life, until she died, little Duyen had never once had her photograph taken. Because she died out on the street, according to Nung customs, little Duyen could not be worshipped inside the house where she was born. Her altar consisted of a piece of decayed wood tied and propped outside the wooden window of the rammed earth house, with no worship photo and no offerings whatsoever. The murder of little Hoang Thi Duyen and the death inside the bunker of Havan Pao were not merely a shocking criminal story, but a costly lesson, exposing a deep social welfare loophole regarding mentally ill offenders. Law and medicine have their own theories. When patients are stable, they have the right to be returned to their families and society. Yet, between those pages of medical theory books and the reality of life lies a vast chasm that cannot be filled because of the community's very real fear. The community is not to blame for driving a killer away, because the instinct for survival forces them to protect their children. The perpetrator's family also bore overwhelming pressure when a poor high country household could not shoulder the responsibility of a specialized psychiatric hospital. To this day, the case of Havan Pao is still frequently recalled as a typical case committed by a mentally ill person, and several media outlets have also called this the most horrific case executed by a psychiatric patient in Vietnam. Thank you, valued audience, for watching the entire video. Please leave your comments below for us. Goodbye and see you again. Bye and see you again. Bye and see you again.